Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video I want to take a look at the development and release practices at CIG and how they affect the final product. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons for their support of the channel and the Armory. Over the last few years, many backers have observed a strange trend. Many features are released in a half-complete state and many bugs make it into the live release. And then we wait for months or years for fixes and completions. Now, some of you will say that's just how it goes in an alpha. But sometimes we get new features that have major issues and some very obvious gaps, or features that broke existing features and fixes are nowhere to be seen. A good example is the inventory interaction that was in-game between 3.17 and 3.23. It was released without a search or a move all function, which are essential for inventory, and it took almost 2 years to get that move all button. Another great example is towing, which not only didn't work on release due to missing changes to the law system, but it was broken again with the release of master modes because CIG completely forgot about it when implementing master modes, among other things. This can be summed up as new features and updates having unforeseen side effects impacting the existing product. Now, bugs and incomplete builds are a common issue in software development, but they can be addressed with proper testing before release and analysis before the build is started. But before we talk about how these issues present at CIG and how CIG can fix them, we need to talk about the process they likely use. First, what is Star Citizen? It's a game, but a game is technically just software, and the development process is very similar to how other software is made. Most companies these days use agile methods, and we don't need to go into the details on how agile works. But the basic goal is to be able to periodically deliver parts of the final product and gather feedback from the client. And you immediately see how this approach might be suitable for a game that aims to have a regular release schedule of new content. Now, there are a few caveats. First, the iterations in Agile are usually pretty short, only a few weeks. And most companies don't do major releases that often. But we have tools that allow us to deploy releases of pretty much any size pretty much seamlessly. This is generally enabled by having a good coverage of automated tests that can verify that the code is working as expected and nothing was broken. Now, Star Citizen is a game, which is nearly impossible to test automatically besides the backend services, which is one of the main arguments to split them away from the main game server. Second, generally most companies don't aim for regular releases. Now, yes, there are release dates and deadlines, but these are rarely regular and tend to be very flexible. Especially with bespoke software, releases are tied to client requests and deadlines are negotiated accordingly. For products provided as services, this gets more complicated, and the release timeline depends on the internal demands and decisions. But major releases are generally reserved for when major features are completed, or at least in my experience. Some companies and products might do this differently. For example, Meta is known for quickly iterating versions and using A/B testing to try out new features on their users. So, from a development perspective, Star Citizen is a product. However, the players are not the client. Essentially, CIG is. Because they determine internally which features are included and when, and they take very little high-level input from the players. Now, to develop a product, you first need to figure out what you are making. Star Citizen is supposed to be the best space sim ever. Simple, right? Well, not really. That statement doesn't tell us much. But the same can be said about any high-level summary of any product. YouTube is just a website to upload and view videos, right? So to actually figure out what we are making, we need to make a more detailed description and start breaking down the different features we're looking for. For example, we want players to be able to fly their spaceship from planet to planet seamlessly without loading screens. This is much better, but still not good enough to start working. So what do you need to make this happen? Well, you need some planets, you need some ships, and you need a flight system, some controls, and a way to interact with the world. This is still not good enough, but you get the idea. You decompose complex ideas into smaller segments, and eventually you get into small enough chunks that a single developer can actually start working on them. This is software development in a nutshell. The idea is that each of these chunks can be completed in a reasonable amount of time, usually as a part of one sprint. It can be tested and it generates some values for the client or the product. Game development is a bit more complicated. For most features, you're not just writing code, but you also have to create assets, animations, record voice lines, and so on. Fortunately, you have many different teams, each focusing on a different area, and you can split up the work. But that of course complicates planning and management. But overall, this development process has some defined steps. First, you analyze what you have to do, decompose it into small items that can be worked on. Then you assign the work to the relevant teams, then they do the work, then the different assets and code can be integrated together and tested, and finally released as a feature. And of course, these steps can repeat over the course of development of a single feature, because you might discover new requirements as you go and need to address them. To help you better understand this, let's take a look at an example. We are going to take a look at an existing feature in the game and try to figure out how the development might have looked like using the process I just described. I picked refineries as we already have them in game, and because on the surface they might seem simple and like they impact only one gameplay loop, but if you dive deeper it's actually way more complicated. So what do you need to do to implement the refineries into Star Citizen? Well, first of all, you need the physical locations found at space stations. So right there is a huge task for the designers and art teams. Then you also need to create new NPC behaviors for the NPCs running around the refinery decks. This also comes with creating clothes and equipment for those NPCs. So that's a few more art and AI programming tasks. Then you also need some input from the narrative teams to get the signage, announcements, and other text and lore bits, and some voice acting and so on. Then we can finally start thinking about how players are going to interact with refineries directly. We need to create an interface for players to create and manage their refinery orders. So there are a few tasks for the UI team. You also need to create the actual system that will manage refinery orders. You could probably ship this as a separate service, so that requires some extra development. This also includes implementing the parameters of different refining methods, the mechanism of emptying the ore bags and retrieving cargo, and other use cases within the refinery flow. This is already a lot of work. But now we have to think about the indirect ways this new feature impacts players and other features. Analyzing indirect impacts of new features is a very important part of planning when you want to add something new. And this is the step I think CAG are skipping or not paying enough attention to. For example, to fully utilize the refineries, the player has to have a cargo ship to transport the refined materials to a landing zone to sell. So it might be a good idea to add some cargo ship rentals for a reasonable price, and possibly make them available at the refineries. And while you're adding rentals, you might as well add a prospector rental for people who want to try out mining. CAG did this, and it was a great move back then. But also, some of the materials people can create by refining are already available in the economy as trading commodities. So you're essentially increasing the volume of these commodities in the system. So it might be a good idea to increase the capacity of landing zones and other locations that accept these to accommodate this influx. CAG did all of this, and that's why station refinery decks are a great example and show that CAG can build their features properly. Refinery decks remain mostly unchanged to this day besides a few tweaks and bug fixes. And this shows how well-built features can last. Though there are some things that could have been done differently with the design of refinery gameplay, but that's a topic I'm going to cover probably next week. So what can CAG do to keep build quality high? Well, before they start, they need to ask themselves, how does this create value for the player? How does it affect them, directly and indirectly? Does it impact any other features? At this stage, it's actually very useful to get inputs from multiple people to get different perspectives, or even the backers. When master modes were first shown, a lot of people pointed out how non-combat ships were excluded from the demo and might not have been included in the design. And they were somewhat correct. With inventory kiosks, CAG never stopped to think, what does the drawer add for the player? And they eventually had to walk back the entire UI because of this, even though the UI wasn't the problem and it was actually okay. Then, when they're done with the internal work, they need to take care of testing the new features and make sure everything works the way CAG expect and want. As I mentioned, this is a bit difficult for a game and bugs will get through, but I think with a little extra work, quality of life could improve. And that actually ties into the massive bug backlog that Star Citizen has. Some bugs remain unfixed for months or years, and that's a problem. Now, obviously there is a pressure to release new features and content, and that takes priority over bug fixes. But leaving bugs unfixed is detrimental to quality of life. And with resources freeing up from Squadron 42, CAG could possibly look into putting together small teams to take on bugs while other features are worked on. And that brings me to my final idea. To an external observer, it appears that CAG are having trouble keeping their release schedule. We haven't had a release on time in years, and generally every release loses some content right before it's out because it's not ready. So it might be time to move away from the quarterly release schedule. I would replace it with more frequent minor patches containing bug fixes and variable frequency major patches. The notable difference being that I would reserve major patches for when features are ready for release. Depending on dependencies and the teams working on them, this could mean we would get more frequent but smaller feature releases. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? How can CAG improve their development process? Is the release schedule detrimental? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.